Australians have had a love affair with motorcycles since the early models rolled off the production line in the beginning of the 20th century. Our passion for riding soon became a quest to push man and machine to their limits, and our motorcycle racing heritage was born. From my earliest memories as a young boy growing up here in Wollongong, New South Wales, I was obsessed with the idea of going fast on a motorcycle. My heroes back then were people like Kenny Roberts, Barry Sheen, Jack Finlay, Ray Quincey. But their heroes at that time were guys like Ken Rumble, Maurie Quincey, Ken Kavanagh. They were the heroes and the legends of that period. In this film, you will see some of the heroes and exciting moments in our rich motorcycling history. Who were these pioneers of motorcycle racing in Australia, and when did it all begin?
Well, I think they probably started racing as soon as there were two motorcycles confronting each other. Which one was fastest? Or, I mean, obviously it grew out of the cycling era, the push bikes. Early motorcycles were basically bicycles with engines slung in them somehow or other, and little more than that. But it was you can pretty well date it from that period, just around the turn of the century, in virtually every city. Anywhere that there was organised cycling activity, and particularly where there was a cycling track, because bicycle racing was very big and it was a professional sport. They had professional, properly constructed circuits, usually oval circuits, banked circuits, and it wasn't too long before the motorcycle started to venture onto those.
The best known of the early cycle tracks was at St Kilda, suburb of Melbourne, around what was known at the time as the St Kilda Cricket Ground. That was used for a number of years, but there were velodromes in other suburbs of Adelaide, Melbourne and Sydney, and indeed the showgrounds in each of those cities were used as well, which was of course a dirt surface.
Motorcycling has always been a part of the Australian scene, virtually since they sort of were invented. It used to be TTs and Grand Prix way back in 1908, 1910, mostly on road circuits. And when we say road circuits, in those days they would have been just gravel circuits, and they'd had quite long races, up to 200 miles long, which would require a few fuel stops and stuff.
The most famous of the motorcyclists in that time was a fellow by the name of Eric Tyler, who was known by all and sundry as Longy. Because of his height, he was well over 6 feet tall. Eric was in fact the first professional motorcyclist in Australia. But a young man by the name of Jack Booth also started being very successful, once again riding triumphs for Millage Brothers in about 1911. By 1912 he was winning a lot of races, particularly on the banked cycle tracks rather than road races, although he did compete in both. Jack Booth set a new 1 hour record at the St Kilda cycle track in 1913, riding his Triumph, and that was very heavily publicised at the time. There were Australian-made, or more correctly assembled motorcycles when Minerva kits were available from Belgium, where all a cycle retailer had to do was buy the European kit, bolt their Minerva engine into what was a standard cycle frame. There were many Australian makes at the time. In the years 1913 to 14 there were over 200 local makes of machine on the market.
You could buy virtually anything in a kit form and make it up yourself, but also the local industry started around there, but then increasingly did things like, there were industries like wheel building, petrol tank manufacturing, seats, mud guards, increasingly the local content was greater. There weren't too many engines built here. Generally it was the power units were still brought in, and things like carburetors and ignition systems and things that was just cheaper and more convenient, I think, to bring those things in.
When World War I was declared during 1914, of course Australia was involved, and motorcycle sportsmen at the time, being young men, were called on to do their duty for their country, and large numbers of them went overseas with the Australian infantry forces. That meant that there weren't many of them left in the country, and motorcycle racing and sport generally quickly died down. By the end of the war in 1918, there wasn't much money around, and it took a few years to recover. The English and American motorcycle manufacturers in the immediate post-World War I years were putting a lot of money into developing new bikes, and so it was expected that the new breed of bikes available after the war would be quite a bit different, quite a bit faster than those that went before them. By 1919, the American makes, and in particular Harley-Davidson and Indian, were sending out to Australia for the use of the agents in each state racing bikes that were so far in front of those available from the English or any of the local manufacturers that they started to dominate.
These were mostly made for board track racing. Board track racing was quarter mile, half mile circuits on push bike tracks at the time with 60-degree banking, and the guys would just circulate around there up to 100 miles an hour on the bikes of this type. Fixed speed, no throttle control at all, just to cut out on the handlebars, just to slow them up when you needed to slow up a little bit for the corners. And they would sort of circulate for quite long races on these type of bikes. Turned out reasonable sort of power, as I say, good for 100 mile an hour. Most of the guys that were riding were push bike type people, and they were sort of used to being in there with elbows and all the rest of it. They'd run 6 of these bikes to a race, and very, very close racing, very noisy racing, very smoky racing, you know, because little short stubby pipes, they'd be popping away at not really high revs, you know, about 3,000 RPM is what they sort of used to do in those days. These were about $500 in the US. You could buy a T-model Ford for about $150, so they were fairly expensive in those days. Eventually Harold Parsons took over the riding of this particular bike.
Harold Parsons toured the countryside as a speedway rider, a road racer. He rode in stunts, he did record attempts, he did basically anything with a quid in it. He was a professional rider and he was very well paid.
He'd started out in 1914 riding for A.G. Healing and Company in Melbourne, riding their precision engine bikes, but was quickly snapped up by other better financed distributors when his riding ability became known. He broke the 24-hour record that had been established before the First World War by such a margin that it was quite a while before anyone broke it again.
Yeah, he was a hero of everybody in Melbourne. You know, although horse racing and push bikes and football were also big, they tell me that you know, Harold Parsons was the man.
In the years, particularly after World War I and certainly before World War II, there were a lot of record runs between cities. Melbourne to Sydney was an obvious one, Melbourne to Adelaide. Indeed, there were a couple of runs across the Nullarbor.
It was also absolutely amazing that even the times they did over goat tracks in those days, you'd be flat out doing them today.
Well, in the 1920s, there were very few of the banked cycle tracks that had been used before the war. So motorcycle racing tended to be conducted on what were normally horse racing tracks or other venues that had a grass surface. But it was very dangerous because the surfaces were often quite rough and they had the ever-present danger of the horse running rail on the inside of their circuit. The grass track racing was initially dominated by Indian and Harley once again, but by 1923 and 24, AJS had become dominant. The AJSs were much smaller bikes, usually 350cc capacity, much smaller than the Americans, but they were light, agile, and were able to be thrown around in a way that the bigger bikes couldn't. A Melbourne-based tuner by the name of Alan Bruce started to make a name for himself tuning AJSs, and in fact was engaged by the AJS agents, who were Stillwell and Parry in Melbourne, to lead a team of AJS bikes. During the late 1920s, the grass track racing was largely replaced by newer venues like the Melbourne Velodrome, which lasted only a few years but was very popular and very dangerous during that time.
The velodrome only ran for about 3 years because of the problems with deaths, and so many riders got killed, and it was pretty dangerous, and the coroner eventually closed it because it was too dangerous.
The most famous of the tracks in Melbourne, or infamous probably, was the Motordrome, which was built and promoted by John Wren, who was a bit of a character, and it was a big professional show with big prize money, lots of overseas competitors coming out here basically for the money that was involved. It was a big show, and there were similar shows like that in Sydney. Maroubra Speedway was the equivalent in Sydney. It was a huge concrete bowl that cost a massive amount of money to build, and basically didn't last very long at all.
By the late 1920s, road racing had started to become more popular, patterned after the famous Isle of Mann road races in the UK. The first of the well-known road racing circuits was at Phillip Island, where a rectangular circuit was laid out on public roads, most of which was dirt. The first Australian Grand Prix for cars were raced there, and Australian TT motorcycle races as well. These were well supported, again by the trade, in a similar manner to what the grass track and banked track racing had been in earlier years.
Sidecars were another thing that I think 50% of motorcycles in the 20s probably had a sidecar attached to it, and in the majority they were locally made. That was a huge industry. Sidecars were very popular because basically you could carry more people. Cars were still expensive and fairly scarce. Obviously the most convenient method of carrying more people was to bolt something on the side of it, and also they were commercial vehicles. You could buy any amount of sidecars, or outfits as they were called, built to commercial specifications. Butchers and bakers and candlestick makers and tradesmen of all kinds used outfits. Sidecar racing obviously grew as a part of the marketing of motorcycling, so it was a commercial market that was exploited. Racing sidecars was exactly the same. They were motorcycles fitted with outfits, and not particularly sophisticated. There were attempts made to gain the competition advantage by building special sidecars as opposed to simply road-going gadgets hitched to the side of bikes.
Phil Irving was one of the best known motorcycling exports of this country, best known for his design of the Vincent HRD motorcycles in the 1930s through to the 1950s. Phil started his motorcycle racing in Australia, riding firstly a privately owned AJS and then a distributor-supported AJS in long-distance trials and some racing. Phil became very good at the 24-hour and longer trials and in fact became the 1926 motorcycle trials champion in Victoria. When Alan Bruce went to England in 1929, he was followed not long after by Phil Irving, who in fact went the long way, getting there as the passenger in a motorcycle and sidecar, an HRD in fact, with a visiting Englishman. When Phil got to England, he found immediate employment with Velocet and went on to develop a very well-known and famous career with Velocet, HRD and other companies in England.
You know, talking about Phil Irving, you know, who eventually became recognised as probably one of the top designers and one of the guys that sort of could have a lot of lateral thinking about engine design. He was very heavily involved in motorcycling in the early days, talking about the 20s, you know. He was an AJS dealer in Ballarat, so he was a very experienced guy before he even really got into the serious business of motorcycling design. Of course, you know, you'll see up on my shelf up there, just up here is Phil Irving's Tuning for Speed, which was the Bible for everybody. You know, that's where we learned it all from. I think I got my first copy in about 1950, one of the first editions. Everything he said in there came from real experience, you know, it was real practical stuff, you know, no theory about it, just this is what happens, this is the way you did it. And I still refer to it, you know, and I've had a fair experience with motors from those days. Phil Irving's, you know, Bible is the one to go with, yeah.
Returning to Australia in the early 1950s, he was involved particularly with Lex Davison in the development of Vincent engined racing cars for hill climbing and was one of the instigators of the Phillip Island circuit during the 1950s. During the 1930s, Tasmania and Western Australia, there weren't as many riders, there was not the money available, and so they couldn't afford to close off public roads in the way that was necessary for road racing. A readily available venue for racing was a beach, and it was very common, particularly in Tasmania, to use some of the longer beaches like 7 Mile Beach near Hobart, Greens Beach near Launceston and Hawley Beach near Devonport for beach racing. Beach racing was very popular in those states. Again, they used home-tuned specials rather than the factory races because they simply didn't have the money to afford those. Beach racing lasted a short while after World War II in Tasmania, which was always its home, but by the early 1950s even Tasmania was finding road racing in the form of ex-World War II airfield circuits, which were readily available on farming properties after the war.
There were no circuits basically because of the cost of building them. Circuits by and large came into being after the war because of the surplus of ex-airstrips. Airstrip racing really started the circuit thing going. There were just about every state had wartime airstrips left over. Western Australia had Caversham, Gawler in South Australia, there was Fisherman's Bend in Melbourne, Mount Druitt in New South Wales, Lowood in Queensland. They were all wartime airstrips. Some of them, like Mount Druitt, grew out of a single strip by adding a perimeter road, which became, in effect, a lap.
Well, Fisherman's Bend was one of our only circuits we had them days. We had Darley, we had a couple of others, but Fisherman's Bend was a big meeting where the bikes, just a lot of speed. They altered it a couple of times and put little corners across to make it into a circuit. The circuit was quite good and marked out very good. It was just up one side of the airstrip and back the other, and went out in a run down to the left, and then round another corner and back again, and down along the strip again. But there was no riding skills in it whatsoever. It was mostly power and speed at Fisherman's Bend.
Well, Bathurst was an exception because it was built, well, they call it a scenic drive, but it was always going to be a motor racing circuit. Bathurst was a centre of motor racing, or motorcycle racing particularly, right from the 30s, using public roads. But as the opposition to closing off the main roads, the main road between Sydney and Goulburn was part of it, grew, I think luckily the council in Bathurst and the mayor had the foresight to utilise a lot of cheap labour around the place from the Depression and build what they called a scenic drive over Bald Hill, which became Mount Panorama, and that was just a stroke of genius because it was used from 1938 for car and motorcycle racing, and has done ever since. Reliability trials, as they were generally known, became very, very popular, again fuelled by manufacturers who wanted to be able to publicise their machines' achievements. We had a 24-hour trial in Adelaide, which was just simply 24 hours in the saddle. There wasn't teams of riders or anything. You just basically went for it for 24 hours, and the very few people could do that, and very few machines were able to do it. But the success of those was very widely publicised, and the reliability trials weren't necessarily 6-day trials, but they were more over set distances. There might have been a 1,000 miles trial or 1,500 miles or whatever, and they went through to a certain amount of days or time, and they seemed to always manage to run them in the harshest weather conditions, mud, rain, snow, sleet, whatever. So they were pretty savage sort of events. The Red X trial of 1954 was billed as the world's toughest event, and it was not feasible to run the motorcycle trial over the same distance that the car trial was run, but still in all, the route that they chose was pretty serious. It started in Sydney in Parramatta Park, went south through Nowra, down through the coastal region, ended up in Melbourne, went from Melbourne across to Adelaide, Adelaide up to Broken Hill, and from there through Menindee and back to Sydney by a very circuitous route. The weather turned absolutely vile about halfway through it when they got to Broken Hill. In fact, it was almost abandoned because what is usually a dust bowl out there was just a sea of mud. But it was a really tough event. Yeah, well, scramble racing was really just another form of racing, pretty well using exactly the same bikes for whether it was trials riding, scramble racing, road racing. Yeah, the same sort of machinery was pretty well used all through, perhaps with a change of tyres if you were lucky, but generally not. Hill climbing, didn't matter what it was, everybody rode the same sort of stuff.
Oh, they were basically a road bike. Absolutely. With mine, we had it as light as we possibly could. We took the big saddle tank off and just put a small tank in there that would hold half or 3/4 of a gallon of fuel, and put a knee bar in where the tank would be so you can hang on with your knees, and stripped everything off, run a speedway front wheel without any brake. The bike was stripped down to as light as you could possibly get it to make it more usable and easier to manage, because they were rigid frames and just ordinary girder forks. They were fairly rough, well, not fairly, a very rough ride it was. Yeah, my style of riding was on speedway style. It was due to other people's influences, and instead of using the front brake, I just used to use the speedway front wheel and hardly use the back brake at all. Just change down a gear or two and just lay the bike into the corner like a speedway rider. And some of the odd places you had to have a brake to sort of pull up a bit, but you could just change down pretty rapidly on those engines. They were fairly substantial. You know, for a couple of years I sort of did just about rule the roost in Victoria anyway. Well, Victoria was the home of scrambling anyway.